Hi, I'm Andy with Integrity Data Insights. Welcome to a moment of integrity. It's been a little bit since I put one of these videos together, but when it comes to integrity, I thought there's no one better to highlight than the legend of Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. Now, many will remember MLK because of his I Have a Dream speech and other sound bites etched into the history of the civil rights movement. Today I want to focus on another chapter of his life, a controversial situation that involved him sitting in a dangerous labor camp that ended up changing the outcome of the 1960 presidential election. Find out what happened and hear how sitting on the sidelines cost a candidate a presidential election. Today's moment of integrity is focused on the Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. I read this book called 9 Days, The Race to Save Dr. Martin Luther King Jr.'s Life and Win the 1960 Election. It's a great book by Stephen and Paul Kendrick, and this book covers a very short time leading up to the 1960 election between JFK and Richard Nixon. Setting for this book is the deeply segregated American South in 1960, specifically Atlanta, Georgia. Now, Jim Crow laws were in full effect. That meant businesses could take actions to segregate black people from others. Black people could not eat in the same restaurants as white people. Rich's Department Stores was a chain of big department stores in the South. So, students of local colleges had organized protests against Rich's Department Store in Atlanta. They didn't like that they were unable to eat in the same place as others, simply due to the color of their skin. And they convinced MLK to join them in their efforts, and they were successful in getting him to participate. So, on an October day in 1960, students peacefully attempted to dine in the Magnolia Room. They were told by the Rich's staff, "We're sorry, we can't serve you here, but we do have facilities for you in the basement." There was some back and forth. MLK and the other black students asked to be served in the same room as the white folks were allowed to. The staff refused, and MLK and the students refused to leave. Eventually the police are called, so they were arrested. 52 people were arrested that day. So he finds himself in jail, and along with many of the other students, he refuses bail unless these segregation laws were changed. Now at the time, it's just weeks away from a very tight presidential election between John F. Kennedy, JFK, and Richard Nixon. At this point, both presidential candidates stayed out of voicing an opinion on the matter. At the time, Republicans, Richard Nixon's party, were known to count on the support of black voters. So MLK is still in jail. There's some jockeying and negotiating with local officials to try to work something out. Then, a few days later, a judge in another Georgia county decided that this incident of him being arrested violated MLK's probation. So why the heck was he on probation, you might ask? An incident that happened earlier, a traffic incident. In this incident, MLK was in the car with his white friend. During that time, he was found that he didn't have a Georgia's driver's license since he had moved from Alabama. So he ended up having to go to court. His lawyer convinced him to plead guilty. So he did, and he paid a $25 fine. So he didn't, think it would be a big deal. Little did he know that this incident would be used against him in the short time. So, back to the protest, instead of him being released like the other students, he's transferred to another court in Georgia, in another county, and there's going to be a hearing to be held whether he violated parole. So MLK goes in front of this judge, the same one that he had pled guilty to 6 months earlier. He's paraded past tons of cameras and in handcuffs. It's a big spectacle. And in this court hearing, MLK testified And, he claimed, I didn't know that this would result in probation. I didn't know I was on probation and that the rules related to this. Judge hears this, he rules, and he sentences MLK to 4 months in a labor camp. His attorney argues for bond, which the judge denies. Now, to many, this 4-month sentence was considered a possible death sentence for MLK. Remember, this is 1960s. These camps were notorious for their black inmates disappearing or being killed during their stays there. There were racist guards that were known to kind of look the other way and let the inmates, take care of things themselves. MLK's wife, Coretta, she can't hold back tears thinking what's going to happen to her husband, and that he's going to likely miss the birth of their expectant child. All of this over a driver's license discrepancy. So the incident starts to make the national news, and both presidential candidates had yet to take a stance on it. They were afraid to rock the boat or lose the white vote so close to the election. They didn't know what to do. Advisors from both candidates, were busy behind the scenes trying to change the mind of the higher-ups to, voice support for MLK. And in the end, only JFK's team was successful, in breaking through those ranks. At times, members of the campaign, they did this without permission from JFK himself and his brother Ted and some other high levels in the campaign. Some of their actions eventually made it to the press, and it kind of forced the higher-ups to react to it. The perception was that JFK and team were doing what they could to get MLK released. One headline read, "Kennedy phoned to express concern, King's wife says." And eventually the higher-ups did get involved, even with Bobby Kennedy directly calling the judge to petition for MLK's release. So there was a lot of press on that and whether it happened or not, but it did happen. On the other side with the Republicans, the baseball player Jackie Robinson, he's a dedicated Republican, and he's trying to work to influence Richard Nixon to show his support for the release of MLK. But it didn't work. Their team would respond with no comment when they were asked about the matter. In a meeting, Nixon told Robinson he felt that it would appear to be like grandstanding, if he chose to do that and just make it, he chose not to. So he chose not to say anything. So the final push for the election, JFK went all in on the public perception that his team had, worked to help get MLK out of jail, and that Nixon had remained silent. JFK ended up winning the election. There was a big shift in the Southern black voters. There's an author, Joshua Farrington, that said, the 1960 election proved to be a decisive turning point in the GOP's relationship with black voters. So Nixon and the Republicans lost Georgia despite winning the city of Atlanta itself, but it wasn't enough to overcome the wave of voters that swung to Kennedy. In interviews later, Nixon later claimed that he felt that MLK was given a bad rap, but he didn't think it was really ethical. He was a lawyer, and he didn't think it was ethical to try to call a judge and influence in that way. So he chose to stay out of it. And I just wanted to share some quick reflections on all of this. In studying the events and learning, what had happened in this book, I was surprised to hear that MLK was initially resistant to the idea of being involved in the protests. He didn't want to do it. It took some convincing and some back and forth. Obviously he's aware of the dangers, the hassle, the emotional toll this all would take. And hear me, I'm not in any way saying that to take anything away from MLK. In the end, he did do it. But I want to mention this point that, he's just like you and me. He internally did have resistance about taking a stand. I think it's easy to look at MLK and think, there's no way that he ever felt scared or, felt like sitting this one out, let someone else handle it. Not a chance that he was like that. And I think our vision of him being so strong that there isn't any room for those visions, But as I reflect on it, it's even more admirable that he did what he did because of that. He didn't want to do it, and he did it anyway. He didn't want to get arrested and be separated from his pregnant wife, but he did it. So if your initial reaction to taking a stand on something with integrity, or taking something that you feel isn't right, if your initial response is no, I don't really want to do that, then that's okay. I mean, it wasn't for MLK either. So my second and final observation: sitting on the sidelines can really cost you when it comes to matters of integrity. It certainly is a risk to stick your neck out and make a choice to, take actions like MLK and those students did. In flipping to the Nixon campaign, they made a choice to stay neutral. They weighed the risk, and they ultimately sided against taking a stand for what was going on in Atlanta. You can argue, well, did they have to do anything? Did they have to say anything? Was this their battle to fight? Well, by staying silent, Nixon and his team made a choice to the public to let the public ultimately decide where they stood. They let JFK and that team fill the void of silence, and they controlled the narrative. They told the American people what Nixon stood for, even if it wasn't true, and it cost them. In the end, in later interviews, Nixon acknowledged this. In the current age of social media and almost instant speed of news, and the pressure for individuals and companies to take a stand on numerous society issues, it's immense, even when that issue isn't directly related to them or their business. Think about the NFL and the national anthem, companies like Walmart and Amazon, selling the Confederate flags, all things related to the Me Too movement and the companies that impacted, that hired people that were involved in that. Staying neutral is always an option, but it is a choice. And you have to accept this and acknowledge that by not speaking out and letting your stance be known, the public will decide for themselves. And many times it may not be the conclusion that you want them to come to. And it can be completely inaccurate. So that's a risk that needs to be weighed when deciding to stay neutral or take a stance. That's all for this episode of A Moment of Integrity. Thank you so much for joining me. Once again, I am Andy with Integrity Data Insights.